Good morning and welcome to the third of the videos that I'm making about the roe deer. And in this episode I'd like to concentrate on a year in the life of a deer. And when I was thinking about this, I found it difficult to know exactly where to start because deer don't have a calendar, they don't begin the year on January the 1st, they don't understand time in the way that we do. So what I've decided is to try to concentrate on three elements. And those elements are food, reproduction and communication. I'm going to start with reproduction because obviously that's where conception takes place and it's the beginning in a sense. And for roe deer, the most active time of the year for them is what is known as the rut. And that's when the buck begins to take a real active interest in the female, the doe. And to use a well-known phrase, let's cut to the chase, because that's exactly what happens in the rut. The buck will chase the doe for days on end, hours on end, and they will go round in circles, following each other. The doe will be not ready and not receptive until a particular moment. And until that happens, they keep going round in these circles, round and round. And actually some people believe that these circles which are made, often round a shrub, often they are a figure of 8, and people have wondered over the years whether these are the origin of fairy rings. Whether that's true or not, no one knows. But the activity of the rut, which takes place between the middle of July and the middle of August, has actually begun much earlier than that in the year. Because for the bucks, their sexual activity begins in April, March or April. And what begins to happen for them is that their testicles start to grow bigger, they are producing more sperm, and that process goes on from April until July, August. And that's the time that the buck is said to be territorial. And he marks out his territory in various different ways, largely by the use of glands which secrete a scent onto trees, bushes where he travels in his territory. And the buck between April and the rut is territorial, and he will try to defend that territory. And in that process, he may encounter other bucks, larger than him, smaller than him, and it may be that there is some fighting between the bucks. Sometimes those fights can result in fatalities. I've never, in fact, experienced myself coming across a fatality resulting from a fight, but I've seen it taking place. The doe is getting into what is called estrus, and when she is ready and receptive, she will stop going in front of the buck and will stand and let him mount her and serve her. And that's the moment when conception takes place. So in a sense, it's the beginning of the life of the next year's offspring, which will be born in May, June of the following year. Naturally, you will be entitled to think, or you might think, that is a very long gestation period between autumn and the height of summer the next year. And for a creature which is no bigger than a goat, that's an unusually long gestation period. And there was a German who was interested in nature in the 1860s, and he asked himself this question: why is it that this creature, which is not very large, has such a long gestation period? And for a while the thinking was that actually there must be another rut which takes place later in the year, maybe in November or December. And that's actually when conception takes place. But observation in the field led him to say, well, I don't experience that phenomenon taking place. I believe that the rut is really July, and therefore I have to wonder why such a long gestation period. And that leads in turn to me having to say something about the process of delayed implantation, or what is called embryonic diapause. And what happens is that when the egg in the female, in the doe, is fertilized, what happens is that a blastocyst comes into being, and this is a cell which contains many cells which are rapidly changing. And after 3 or 4 days from fertilization, you can see in the blastocyst that there is the beginning of the embryo in the middle, and round the outside of the blastocyst is the material that will feed that embryo. But what happens in delayed implantation is that that process stops. Rather than going on naturally, something causes it to delay itself. And the science around this is still not fully understood, but certainly what is known is that that process of almost like the animation has been stopped, that process goes on until January. And in January, the process starts again. And so the blastocyst then becomes a proper embryo. It travels down and implants in the uterus. So that the gestation period of a roe is actually that period between January and May. And this German who discovered this really made a bit of natural history, because the process of delayed implantation wasn't really understood until then. And the roe deer is unique in the sense that it's the only deer that exhibits this process, and it's famous for having been involved in that process of learning about delayed implantation. So if we leave that for a moment and go back to what happens after the rut. It's taken place in July, August, and it needs to be remembered that at that point in time, the doe still has her young at foot. She is still suckling the kids that were born in May, June. So they are only a couple of months old. So after the rut's taken place, she is still being a mother, and she still will suckle that young, sometimes as late as November, December, sometimes even into the new year. Although you will notice if you watch deer that she's trying to wean the young off, and so they may come and want to suckle, and she's trying to get them to become more independent. But that's, in a sense, what the doe spends the rest of the year doing. The buck, having been territorial, no longer has to fight for a territory. And it is said that after the rut, bucks disappear off the face of the earth. Obviously, that's not true. But it is very difficult to see or to find the bucks after the rut. They just seem to be much less in evidence than at other times of the year. So if we leave the process of reproduction for a moment and turn to the question of food, that really, in a way, is the biggest activity that takes place on a daily basis for any wild animal. And so I want to concentrate a little bit on asking some questions about how do deer eat, what do they eat, when do they eat, and see if we can build up a picture of their diet. Okay, turning to the feeding habits of the roe. Roe deer are ruminants, which means that they digest the food and then they chew the cud. They are also browsers, not grazers. The larger species of deer, like fallow and the red deer, they are more likely to be grazers than browsers. And research has shown that roe are what are called generalist, highly selective, opportunistic feeders. In simple terms, what this means is that they eat a lot of different plants. And the selection that they make depends upon various things. It depends upon where they are, what is growing in the location where they're living, so what is there for them to eat. And it's also obviously affected by the seasons. So some things are available at some times in the year and other things are available at other times. They certainly are known to favour certain plants of certain groups or species. And if you'll bear with me just for a moment while I check my notes to get the Latin terms, they're very fond of Rubiaceae, which are the coffees, madders and bedstraws. They're also very fond of the Rosaceae, which are the rose family. These include bramble, dog rose, wild raspberry. They also like the Fagaceae, which are beeches, chestnuts, oaks, and also the Corolaceae, which are catkin-bearing trees, such as birch and hazel. So, if you know what they like to eat, and if you know what is growing on any particular patch, you know probably where to look for roe, because they eat several times in the day. What happens is they spend a lot of time just couched in cover. And when I use the term couched, it simply means that they lie down. It's a term that is also used in heraldry, so that if you look at a coat of arms and see a deer that's lying down, that deer, usually a stag, is said to be couchant, which is lying down, couched. Roe will spend a lot of time in cover, being couched, chewing the cud, and then they will come out and eat. And nobody knows for sure how many times in the day or night they do that. Some people believe that they come out and eat probably once every 2 hours. Other people believe that they come out and eat every 4 hours or so. But they certainly have a cycle where they come out, they eat, they go back into cover. So they will often be found close to good feeding grounds, but where there is also cover where they can just pop out, eat, go back into cover. The diet is also, as I said, affected by the seasons. And in winter, for example, I've just been reading a study about roe deer in Sweden, where there's quite a lot of snow in the winter. And what happens is that because roe deer have quite tiny feet, they have what is called quite a heavy loading on their hoof. And so if there is snow, they very quickly sink into it, unlike the bigger deer that have bigger feet. And if there's more than 50 centimetres of snow, they sink into it, it comes up to their brisket, which is their belly, and they can't any longer paw the ground and get to the food that they like. And what happens is they're very opportunistic, so they change their eating habits and they start eating arboreal fungi and lichen in the winter. And I think it just shows how adaptable a creature the roe is, because they live as far north as the north of Scandinavia and as far south as the arid, dry regions of Italy and Spain, so that they can find a way of living both in those very harsh, cold, wintry conditions and the very arid, dry, hot conditions. The knock-on effect of them eating such a healthy and varied diet, as some people say, 150, 160 different plants. Certainly, I've just read quite a long, detailed study of roe in 2 regions in Italy, where from the analysis of their droppings of the fecal pellets, they have decided that they can show quite conclusively that they're eating at least 79 different species. What happens as a result of them living a wild existence and eating such a healthy diet is that they in turn become an exceptionally healthy creature. They do not suffer hardly at all from disease. They are able to adapt themselves to, as I've just said, a variety of climatic conditions. They reproduce healthily. They look after their young well. The reproduction rate is likely to be in the region of at least 100%. So each time there is a yearly cycle, the deer population, without the intervention of man, will double. And surveys show that the roe population throughout Europe has been on the increase for at least the last 20 years. This poses problems which I might deal with in another time in another video. But what I do want to say, as a result of this healthy diet and the fact that they become healthy creatures, in turn what that means is that the meat that they produce, the venison, is also extremely healthy. It is perhaps the most healthy of the meats which is available for us to eat. And it is increasing in popularity, although there is still much to be done, in a sense, to educate people about the benefits of venison. And I can quickly summarise some of those. It's exceptionally high quality protein. It's what is called a complete protein. It contains essential amino acids which we can't make for ourselves. It's much lower, for example, in saturated fats than beef is. It contains something called heme iron, which is used to make red blood cells, which carry oxygen around the body. It's also thought to aid cognitive function. In other words, it's basically a brain food, which my wife sometimes says I should eat more of. Venison contains large quantities of zinc. It also contains a large variety of B vitamins, and it contains 5 times more omega-3 oils than beef. It seems to me that it is crying out for a detailed education program to promote the eating of venison. To return to the idea of the year and what's going on, if we look at the entry into winter, the doe is still looking after its young, and she does that until the following spring. And the mothering involves a lot of grooming, and I hope that I'll be able to show you some quite sentimental pictures of how roe does mother their young. They are exceptionally good mothers. The buck tends to stay close to the doe throughout the year, but that buck is not necessarily the father of the offspring that is seen. He may be or he may not be. It may be another buck that has taken up with the doe. But often what can be seen is a group, most often of 3, and that group of 3 will usually consist of the doe and her young, because twins are most common, although triplets are not unheard of. In fact, on a piece of land that my wife and I own, the doe on that land this year had triplets, and I can show you some footage of her and her youngsters. That process of just being with the family goes on, as I say, until the following spring, when she begins to try and encourage the young to go off and find a patch of their own. The buck just hangs around. Sometimes in the spring there is a phenomenon known as a coffee bar, and a coffee bar consists of a group of roe deer, usually bucks, and the scientists don't know exactly why this phenomenon occurs, but it's not uncommon to see as many as 6 or 7 bucks together in the winter or in the early part of the new year. But if we try to go forward a little bit, I'd like to say something about how do the animals communicate. And this is, again, something which is something of a mystery to the scientists. We do know that does have a means of communicating with their young, and that consists of a sound which is being called a pheep, which is a kind of little whimper, a squeak. And if mother or young, especially when the young are very small, get lost or they don't know where they are to each other, they will emit this little squeaking sound known as a pheep. And that's one form of communication. Deer also bark, and again, it's not entirely known why, because it's thought that the barking serves several different purposes. And there is also a phenomenon known as counter-barking. And counter-barking consists of one deer barking for some reason, and that barking is taken up by other deer in the vicinity. And myself and a colleague were once in a wood where we were surrounded by roe deer that were barking, and we estimated that there must be 7 separate deer very close to us that were barking at each other or in conjunction with each other for reasons which we could not easily fathom. It was the height of summer and there was a lot of cover, and there was one deer that was barking close to me. It was only yards away, but I couldn't see it, but I'm sure it knew I was there. And I don't know whether that barking was an alarm call to the rest of the deer population to say there is a stranger in our midst. But whatever it was, I can remember one episode that I had where I came very close to a young buck and it barked at me and I barked back at it, which is an amusing exercise because my imitation of a roe deer barking has caused a lot of amusement amongst fellows who are also stalkers like myself. But the sound goes something like "bah, bah," and the Germans pronounce it as B-O-H. Anyway, I had this conversation with a deer where I barked at it and it barked back at me. It was an amusing episode. And the reason why I think I just wanted to say something very briefly about these ideas of communication is that I know we are learning all the time about the amount of communication that goes on in nature that's only beginning to come to light. And so, for example, the scientists are beginning to talk about the way trees talk to each other. And this on one level sounds crazy stuff, but it's not. There is a lot of now established science to corroborate the fact that trees have ways in which they pass messages to each other about the incoming diseases that need to be, where they need to raise their defences against them. And this goes far beyond what I want to talk about in relation to deer, but it's just part of the bigger picture. To pick up on the year, the spring is not the time of beginnings for roe in the same way as it is for some other creatures because of that process that I mentioned of delayed implantation. But it is certainly true that as from January, the young are growing within the doe. The bucks are not at that part beginning to become territorial. That doesn't happen until about April. But the buck is hanging around with the female and her youngsters. And these are the groups, as I said, that you see. And there isn't a great deal of other particular activity going on at this time. But as soon as summer begins in the true sense, what you notice is that the bucks, who have been growing their antlers since December, They are covered in velvet in January, into February, into March, but they are beginning to try and get rid of the velvet on their antlers. So what you see deer doing is fraying, and that's an activity where they rub their antlers against a small stem, often a very whippy branch, which is often no thicker than your finger, and you will see them tossing their heads and getting rid of the velvet on their antlers. And they look very raggy, as though they've got rags and tatters on their antlers, and in fact that's the term that's used. They are said to be in tatters. And they rub off this highly nutritious material, the velvet, which is full of blood, and they become what is called in hard horn, which is a difficult phrase because deer antlers are not horn, they are bone. But if we leave that aside for a moment. So the bucks become clear of their velvet, and they begin to look pretty magnificent. They change their coats in the spring, and I think that in another video you've seen that idea of them becoming very scruffy and then getting their lovely red summery coat. And in May, or mid-May to mid-June, the doe finds somewhere where she will cast her young, and the kids will be left in usually just somewhere where there is long grass. They are odorless at birth, so that they're not easily picked up by predators, although there are no real natural predators left in this country, although a strong fox might take a very, very small deer. But they are odorless, and they somehow know that their greatest way of safety is just to remain completely still, and the mother will come and find them and suckle with them and leave them there, or perhaps move them slightly somewhere else. They are spotty when they are little, and the advice which is out in the public domain, and I think most people now know it, that if you do come across a young deer, the worst thing you can do is to try to move it. There's nothing wrong with where it is. It's a perfectly healthy animal, and it's just remaining quiet and still, and you should just back away and leave it exactly where it is. The young grow very quickly. I think I can show you a video of one that's only just got onto its feet. They're a little bit wobbly to start with, they're quite endearing, but they very quickly become active. They're quite playful, and I know that that's a strange word to describe for a wild animal, but sometimes you can see activity among the youngsters which you can only describe as them having fun. And as they grow, the mother teaches them all sorts of things, so they learn very quickly what they can eat safely, and actually roe can eat pretty much, as I've already said, pretty much everything. They're not susceptible to poisoning from plants in the way that other creatures that browse are. And the young grow very quickly through the summer, and the buck will, as from April, have become more interested in the territory, so he will be seen around. You may witness fighting between him and a younger buck, and the cycle goes on again, beginning again in August with the rut. And this is how the year goes round and round. And for me, it's just a completely fascinating cycle, and one that I've never tired of watching. And I hope some of that enthusiasm's come across in this very brief description of a year in which I could have probably spoken for hours and hours and hours.